May 1943. Camp Barkeley, Texas. The train had been moving for 3 days. Through the slats of the cattle car, the men could see landscapes they didn't recognize, flat earth stretching endlessly under a white sky, nothing like the tight valleys of Bavaria or the green hills of the Rhineland. Some slept. Others stared at their hands. A few younger ones pressed their faces to the gaps in the wood, watching telephone poles blur past like a picket fence at speed. They were prisoners now. Most had been captured in North Africa. Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, once invincible, now scattered across Allied prison camps from Algeria to America. The United States had agreed to take hundreds of thousands of German POWs to ease the burden on Britain. And so they came, by ship and rail, into a country they'd been told was weak, divided, and soft. The propaganda had promised them a quick war. America, the Nazis said, was a nation of criminals and cowards, run by Jews and gangsters, incapable of real military discipline. The soldiers had believed it because they had to. Because the alternative was unthinkable. But now, riding through Texas in May heat so thick it felt like drowning, that certainty was beginning to crack. The train slowed. Through the slats they saw wooden guard towers. Barbed wire. Long rows of tar paper barracks shimmering in the heat. A sign in English they couldn't yet read. Camp Barkeley, U.S. Army Installation. The doors opened. Sunlight flooded in, blinding after days of shadow. American soldiers stood waiting, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, chewing gum. One of them was black. The German prisoners stared. They had been told black soldiers were rare in the American military. Inferior. Kept away from real combat. The man in question looked bored. An officer stepped forward, speaking slow, careful German. Welcome to Texas. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will work. You will eat. You will not escape. If you cooperate, your time here will pass without incident. No one responded. They were marched into the camp, past rows of identical barracks, each labeled with a number painted in white. The ground was hard-packed dirt, the color of rust. The air smelled like oil and mesquite. In the distance they could hear something unfamiliar. Music, maybe? Or shouting. It was hard to tell. Inside the barracks, the bunks were narrow but clean. The windows had screens instead of bars. There were toilets with running water. Soap. Towels. For men who had spent months in the sand, living on black bread and tinned meat, it felt surreal. This is not a prison, one of them said quietly in German. This is better than our own barracks in the Wehrmacht. No one disagreed. But no one said it out loud again. Over the following days the routine became clear. Morning roll call. Work assignments, some to the camp kitchen, others to maintenance, a few to nearby farms. The guards were firm but not cruel. Meals arrived 3 times a day. There was bread. There was meat. Sometimes there was coffee. The letters started arriving in June. Thin, censored pages from home, full of words that had been blacked out by military censors. Mothers writing about rations. Wives asking when the war would end. Brothers describing the bombings, Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin. The cities were burning. The Allies were advancing. The tone in every letter was the same, quiet desperation dressed up as hope. The prisoners read them in silence. They folded them carefully and kept them in their footlockers. At night, lying in the dark, some of them wondered if surrender had been a mistake. Others wondered if it had been a gift. But the questions they asked most often were simpler. Why are they feeding us so well? Why do they let us write letters? Why do the guards call us by name instead of numbers? The propaganda had not prepared them for kindness. It had prepared them for cruelty, for chaos, for a country that barely functioned. What they found instead was something harder to understand. Order. Efficiency. A strange, distant politeness that felt more unsettling than outright hostility. They began to suspect they had been lied to. But the full extent of that lie wouldn't become clear until the afternoon they were loaded onto trucks and driven into the countryside, toward the town of Abilene, where something called a rodeo was scheduled to begin. Late June 1943. Outskirts of Abilene, Texas. The trucks arrived at sunset. Dust hung in the air like smoke. The prisoners could hear the sound before they saw it. A roar of voices, thousands of them, blending into something that sounded like a distant storm. When the truck stopped and the tailgates dropped, they climbed out into a scene that made no sense. A wooden arena. Bleachers packed with people. Men in wide-brimmed hats, women in summer dresses, children clutching bags of peanuts. Flags hanging limp in the heat. A loudspeaker crackling with a man's voice, speaking too fast in English for any of them to follow. And in the center of it all, a ring of packed dirt surrounded by wooden fences, where men on horseback were waiting. The prisoners were led to a section of bleachers set apart from the crowd. Armed guards flanked them, but the rifles stayed lowered. A translator, a German-American corporal named Weber, stood at the end of the row. He looked amused. "You're going to watch a rodeo," he said in German. "It's an American tradition. Cowboys. Horses. Bulls. Think of it as a demonstration." "A demonstration of what?" one of the prisoners asked. Weber shrugged. You'll see. The gates opened. A horse exploded into the arena, bucking violently, its rider clinging to a rope tied around its belly. The crowd erupted. The prisoner next to the speaker flinched. On the field, the rider lasted 8 seconds before being thrown into the dirt. He stood, dusted himself off and waved to the crowd. They cheered louder. What is this? Someone muttered in German. Military training, another replied, his voice uncertain. It has to be. They watched a man rope a running calf in under 6 seconds. They watched another wrestle a steer to the ground with his bare hands. They watched riders race around barrels at speeds that seemed reckless, their movements precise and controlled. And through it all, the crowd screamed, laughed, threw their hats in the air. The prisoners sat in silence. One of them, a former lieutenant named Klaus Bergmann, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the arena. He had been a cavalry officer before the war, trained in classical riding at a military academy in Prussia. What he was seeing now looked like chaos. But beneath the chaos he could see something else. Discipline. Timing. Reflexes honed to the edge of instinct. These are not farmers, he said quietly. The man beside him, a mechanic from Hamburg named Otto, frowned. Then what are they? Klaus didn't answer. He was watching a rider mount a bull, a massive, furious animal that twisted and spun in the air like something possessed. The rider stayed on, barely, his free hand raised above his head, his body moving in perfect counterbalance to the bull's rage. When the buzzer sounded, the crowd stood. The rider jumped off, landed on his feet, and walked away as if nothing had happened. They're soldiers, Klaus said. Or they were trained like soldiers. Otto shook his head. Soldiers don't ride bulls for fun. Maybe American soldiers do. The thought spread through the section like a cold wind. If this was training, if ordinary American men could do this, could control animals this powerful, this dangerous, with nothing but a rope and raw nerve, then what did that say about the army they were fighting? What did it say about the war? The sun dipped below the horizon. The floodlights came on, turning the arena into a stage. A man with a lasso stepped into the ring and began performing tricks, spinning the rope around his body, over his head, through loops so fast the rope looked like a solid circle of light. The prisoners watched. Some of them forgot to blink. Klaus leaned back against the bleachers, his jaw tight. He thought of his training in Prussia. The dressage, the formation riding, the endless drills designed to turn horse and rider into a single weapon. It had been elegant, controlled. But it had never been this. They are showing us what they can do, he said, more to himself than anyone else. They are showing us that we were wrong. Otto looked at him. About what? Klaus gestured at the arena, at the crowd, at the impossible spectacle unfolding in front of them. About all of it. When the rodeo ended, the prisoners were loaded back onto the trucks in silence. The ride back to camp felt longer than it had on the way out. No one spoke. Outside the windows, the Texas plains stretched into darkness, broken only by the occasional light of a farmhouse or the glow of a distant town. Back in the barracks, the conversations began. Did you see the way he controlled that horse? It wasn't just control. It was improvisation. Like jazz. They're not soft. We were told they were soft. Maybe the propaganda was wrong about other things too. Klaus sat on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He had fought in Poland. He had fought in France. He had believed, absolutely, that the Wehrmacht was superior, in training, in discipline, in the warrior spirit that made men willing to die for the fatherland. But tonight, he had watched American civilians do things he wasn't sure he could do. And they had done it not for war but for entertainment. For applause. He thought about the letters from home. The ones that described the bombings, the shortages, the quiet fear that no one was allowed to name. He thought about the officer who had welcomed them to Camp Barkeley, speaking careful German with a patience that felt almost paternal. And for the first time since his capture, Klaus Bergmann allowed himself to wonder if the war was already lost. July 1943. Camp Barkeley, Texas. The days after the rodeo were different. Quieter. The men went to their work assignments, picking cotton in nearby fields, repairing roads, canning vegetables in the camp kitchen. But the conversations had changed. At night in the barracks they spoke in low voices about what they had seen. Some still insisted it had been a display of military readiness. Cowboys, they argued, were America's cavalry, rough, undisciplined, but effective in their own chaotic way. It was the only explanation that made sense within the framework they had been given. But others weren't so sure. If that was military training, Otto said one evening lying on his bunk, then why were there children in the crowd? Why were they selling popcorn? No one had an answer. The camp library had a small collection of English-language books and magazines, donated by churches and civic groups. Most of the prisoners couldn't read them. But a few had studied English in school, and they began to translate, slowly, haltingly, pieces of the world they had landed in. A magazine article about ranching. A newspaper story about a rodeo champion from Oklahoma. An advertisement for Levi's jeans showing a cowboy on horseback, grinning at the camera. The more they read, the less sense their original assumptions made. Cowboys weren't soldiers. They were workers. The rodeo wasn't training. It was a sport. And the Americans, these people who had fed them, housed them, let them write letters home, were not the weak, degenerate nation the propaganda had described. They were something else entirely. Klaus had stopped talking about it, but he couldn't stop thinking. At night, when the others were asleep, he sat on the steps outside the barracks, smoking cigarettes he had bought with camp scrip, watching the stars over Texas. They looked the same as the stars over Germany, but everything else felt different. He thought about his father, a veteran of the First War, who had told him stories about honor and duty and the glory of the German soldier. He thought about the rallies in Berlin, the marching songs, the speeches that promised a 1,000-year Reich. He thought about the faces of the men he had commanded in North Africa. Boys, most of them, who believed they were invincible right up until the moment they died. And he thought about the cowboy who had ridden the bull. The way he had moved, not with the rigid precision of military training, but with something looser, more instinctive. As if he had learned not from a manual but from experience. From failure. From getting thrown and getting back on. Klaus realized sitting there in the dark, that he had been trained to win. But the Americans had been trained to survive. In August, a group of new prisoners arrived from Italy. They were younger, more shaken. One of them, a boy named Dieter, couldn't have been older than 19. He had been conscripted 6 months earlier, sent to Sicily with no training, and captured within 2 weeks of landing. The older prisoners tried to reassure him. The food is good here, they said. The guards are fair. You'll be safe. But Dieter couldn't stop crying. At night, he whispered to himself in the dark, repeating the same words over and over, "We're going to lose. We're going to lose." Klaus found him one morning sitting alone outside the mess hall, staring at his hands. "You're right," Klaus said in German, sitting down beside him. "We are going to lose." Dieter looked at him, eyes red. "How do you know?" Klaus thought about the rodeo. About the trucks and the roads and the food in the factories he had seen from the train. About the casual confidence of the guards, the abundance of everything, the sheer scale of a country that could afford to take hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners and treat them better than their own army had. "Because I've seen what they can do," Klaus said. "And we can't compete with it." Dieter looked away. Then what was the point? Klaus didn't answer. He didn't have one. By the end of summer, the war in Europe had shifted. Italy surrendered. The Soviets were pushing west. The bombing of Germany intensified. In the camp, the prisoners listened to the news on the radio, translated by guards who no longer bothered to hide the truth. The mood in the barracks grew heavier. Some men prayed. Others stopped writing letters home. A few began to learn English, preparing for a future they couldn't yet imagine. Klaus started helping in the camp school, teaching younger prisoners how to read and write in English. It was something to do. Something that felt like building instead of waiting. One afternoon, Corporal Weber stopped by the classroom. He watched Klaus work for a moment, then leaned against the doorframe. "You know," Weber said in German, "most of you still think the rodeo was some kind of military exercise." Klaus looked up. "Not all of us." Weber smiled. "Good. Because it wasn't. It was just a rodeo. That's what we do here. We ride bulls for fun." Klaus nodded slowly. "I know. Do you?" Klaus set down the chalk. "I know that we were wrong. About America. About the war. About everything." Weber studied him for a moment. "That's a hard thing to admit." "Yes," Klaus said. "It is." Weber pushed off the doorframe, turning to leave. But he paused at the door. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you'll do all right here. When the war's over. You're smart enough to see the truth. That's more than most people manage." Klaus didn't respond. After Weber left, he stood at the window looking out at the camp, at the barracks and the guard towers and the wide Texas sky beyond the wire. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, the war was still raging. Men were still dying. Cities were still burning. But here, in this strange place, he had learned something that the propaganda had never taught him. That the world was bigger than he had been told. That strength came in forms he hadn't recognized. And that the hardest battle wasn't on the field, it was in the mind, where certainty gave way to doubt, and doubt gave way to something that might, eventually, become wisdom. April 1946. Camp Barkeley, Texas. ****. The war had been over for nearly a year. In Europe, cities were being rebuilt. Borders were being redrawn. The dead were being counted. In Texas, the prison camp was emptying. Every few weeks, trucks arrived to take men to the port in New York, where ships waited to carry them back across the Atlantic. Klaus Bergman was among the last to leave. He had volunteered to stay. There was a program. Repatriation could be delayed if prisoners were willing to work on reconstruction projects, to help clear rubble, to assist with the massive logistical effort of putting Germany back together. Klaus had signed on. Partly because he wasn't sure what he was going back to. Partly because he wasn't ready to leave. On his final day at Camp Barkeley, he walked the perimeter one last time. The barracks were mostly empty now. The guard tower stood unmanned. The wire was still there, but the gates were open. No one was watching. He passed the mess hall where he had eaten 1,000 meals. The classroom where he had taught English to boys who would return to a country that no longer existed in the form they remembered. The barracks where he had slept and thought, and slowly let go of the man he had been when he arrived. At the gate, Corporal Weber was waiting. He had a duffel bag in one hand, a cigarette in the other. "Ready?" Weber asked in German. Klaus nodded. "As much as I can be." They walked together toward the truck. Around them, the Texas plains stretched in every direction, endless and indifferent. The sky was clear. The wind was warm. "You ever figure it out?" Weber asked. "Figure what out?" "Why we took you to the rodeo." Klaus smiled slightly. "I think so." Weber raised an eyebrow. "And?" Klaus looked back at the camp one last time. "You wanted us to see that we had been lied to. Not just about the war. About everything. You wanted us to see that the world was bigger, stranger, more complicated than we had been told. And you knew that once we saw it, we couldn't unsee it." Weber took a drag on his cigarette. "That's a pretty good answer." "Was it the right one?" "I don't know," Weber said. "To be honest, I think the colonel just wanted to show you guys a good time. Thought it might help morale. Ease the tension." He grinned. "But your version sounds better." Klaus laughed. It felt strange. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed. They reached the truck. Other prisoners were already inside, silent and tired, their faces turned toward the road ahead. Klaus climbed in, found a seat by the window. The engine started. The truck pulled away. Through the window, he watched the camp disappear behind them. Watched the planes roll past. Watched the sky darken as the sun dipped toward the horizon. He thought about the rodeo. About the cowboy on the bull and the crowd and the sheer absurd spectacle of it all. He thought about how he had believed it was military training, because believing anything else would have meant admitting that the foundation of his entire worldview was a lie. And he thought about how, eventually, he had admitted it anyway. 1952. Hamburg, Germany, ***. Klaus Bergmann stood in a schoolroom in a rebuilt neighborhood on the edge of the city. The walls were fresh plaster. The windows were new. Outside, construction cranes dotted the skyline, lifting steel beams into place, rebuilding what the war had destroyed. He was a teacher now. History and English. Most of his students had been children during the war. They remembered the bombings, the hunger, the fear. But they didn't remember the propaganda. They didn't remember the certainty. That was his job. One afternoon, a student raised his hand. "Herr Bergmann, were the Americans really as strong as people say?" Klaus considered the question. He thought about Camp Barkeley. About the trucks and the food and the casual abundance of a nation that could fight a war on two fronts and still have enough left over to be kind to its enemies. He thought about the rodeo, and the lesson he had learned without realizing he was learning it. "Yes," Klaus said finally. "They were. But not in the way we thought." The student frowned. "What do you mean?" Klaus walked to the window, looking out at the cranes, the unfinished buildings, the city slowly coming back to life. "I mean that strength isn't just about weapons or discipline or the willingness to fight. It's about resilience. About the ability to adapt. About knowing that when you get thrown you get back on." The student didn't understand. Not yet. But someday Klaus thought he would. 1968. Abilene, Texas. ***. The rodeo was still running. Every summer, the bleachers filled with families, the loudspeakers crackled, the bulls and broncos exploded into the arena. The crowd cheered. The riders got thrown. They got back on. No one remembered the German prisoners who had sat in a separate section, watching in confusion and wonder. No one remembered the translator who had called it a demonstration. No one remembered the quiet transformation that had begun that night, in the minds of men who had believed the world was one way and discovered, slowly, painfully, that it was something else entirely. But the rodeo remained. And in its own way it carried the memory forward, not as history but as ritual. As a reminder that the world is full of things that don't make sense until you stop trying to fit them into the story you've been told, and start seeing them for what they are. Cowboys weren't soldiers. Rodeos weren't training. America wasn't what the propaganda had promised. And the prisoners who learned that lesson carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Not as defeat but as a kind of liberation. Because once you know the truth you can't go back to the lie. Even if you wanted to. Present day. The camp is gone now. The barracks were torn down decades ago. The land was returned to farmland, then sold, then developed. There's a strip mall where the mess hall used to be. A parking lot where the barracks stood. A Starbucks where men once sat in the dark, whispering about the war they thought they understood. But in archives across Germany and the United States, letters survive. Diaries. Photographs. Oral histories recorded in the 1980s and 1990s, before the last of the prisoners passed away. And in those records the story persists, of the rodeo and the confusion and the slow, quiet realization that followed. Some of the men never let go of the belief that it had been a military demonstration. It was easier that way. Simpler. But others, men like Klaus Bergmann, carried a different memory. Not of defeat but of revelation. Of the moment when the world cracked open and showed them something they hadn't expected. that the enemy they had feared and hated and been taught to despise was capable of kindness and strength, and a kind of wild, joyful confidence that made war seem, in the end, like a failure of imagination. The rodeo still runs every summer. The bulls still buck. The riders still get thrown. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between the cheers and the dust, the memory remains, of the men who came to Texas as prisoners and left as something else. Not defeated, just awake.